There was never like any rivalry between you and Mr. Jackson.
Not to me, no.
Okay.
You
So I
know,
love the story of you. You know, there's all these Prince. I'm sorry.
that's all right.
That's the guy you used to be. There's the story of you turning down bad.
Well, you know, that Wesley Snipes character,
Right.
that would have been me. All right, now you, now you run that video in your mind. The first line of that song is "Your butt is mine."
Your butt is mine.
Now I said, who gonna sing that to whom? Cause you sure ain't singing it to me, and I sure ain't singing it to you. So, right there we got, right there we got a problem.
Before the rivalry had a name, before it hardened into comparison and rumor, the landscape of popular music was already shifting under pressure. The late 20th century was not waiting for heroes. It was manufacturing stages large enough to demand them. Cities glowed brighter. Screens multiplied. Sound traveled faster than bodies. Fame expanded from applause into environment. In that space, two figures were moving toward the center, not yet colliding, not yet aware of how narrow the arena would become. One emerged as continuity perfected, the other as disruption sharpened into form. Both were shaped by discipline, by repetition, by childhood spent inside rooms where performance was not optional. The world that received them wanted spectacle and wanted meaning, sometimes without knowing the difference. It wanted bodies that could carry fantasy at scale. It wanted voices that could turn private desire into public rhythm. It wanted crowns that could be recognized instantly under any light. The industry was ready for a singular figure, a center of gravity that everything else would orbit. But history rarely cooperates with simplicity. When power concentrates, it attracts resistance. When one throne is visible, another is imagined. In this moment, visibility itself became territory. Charts were no longer numbers. They were maps. Airplay was no longer exposure. It was occupation. Every appearance expanded the perimeter of an empire that could not be shared. The 80s did not invent rivalry, but they refined it. Media learned how to amplify difference. Magazines learned how to frame opposition as destiny. Audiences learned how to choose sides without understanding why the choice mattered. The question was never who was better. The question was who would define what better meant. One offered seamlessness, a body engineered for mass identification. The other offered friction, a presence that refused to dissolve into comfort. Both promised transformation. They simply disagreed on its direction. Michael Jackson arrived already carrying history. Not just personal history, but a lineage of expectation. He was read as culmination. Technique polished until it appeared effortless. Emotion calibrated until it seemed universal. His movement erased seams. His voice floated above the mechanics that produced it. He stood at the center of the stage like a capital city, drawing attention inward, harmonizing chaos through precision. The spotlight did not chase him. It obeyed. Prince arrived as challenge, not to a person yet, but to a structure. His sound resisted containment. His image unsettled categories that the industry relied on for order. He did not smooth contradictions. He amplified them. Desire was not softened into romance. It was sharpened into insistence. His presence felt like a border violation. He did not ask for the spotlight to expand. He bent it until it fractured. At first, there was no open conflict, only parallel ascent. Releases landed close together. Innovations echoed across the same cultural corridors. Success in one camp registered as pressure in the other. The industry responded by tightening the frame. Comparisons became inevitable. Interviews leaned toward contrast. Headlines learned to imply competition without stating it. The audience learned to measure identity through alignment. Loving one began to suggest suspicion toward the other. This was not merely about music. It was about how power should look when it dances, about whether intimacy should be coded as innocence or provocation, about whether transcendence comes from refinement or excess. One figure seemed to promise escape from gravity. The other seemed to weaponize gravity itself. One offered a mirror that reflected back the best version of the viewer. The other held up a mirror that refused reassurance. The tension lived beneath language. It was carried in silence, in glances, in stories retold until they hardened into myth. Every award ceremony became a referendum. Every chart position felt like a shift in borders. The stage became an arena where absence spoke as loudly as presence. Even restraint was read as strategy. Even admiration risked being interpreted as concession. No one declared war. None was needed. The conditions were already in place. Desire had learned how to imitate itself. The public did not simply want music. It wanted a narrative strong enough to organize feeling. Rivalry provided that structure. Two figures. One era. A single question that could never be answered cleanly. Who stands at the center when the center itself is unstable? The opening moves were subtle. A performance here. A refusal there. A rumor that traveled faster than fact. Each action gained weight because it entered a system already primed for escalation. The media acted as echo chamber and amplifier. The audience became witness and participant. The artists became symbols long before they chose to be. What followed would not remain contained within careers or catalogs. It would shape how pop understood masculinity, vulnerability, control, and freedom. It would teach the industry how to manufacture opposition and teach the public how to consume it. But in this moment, before the friction ignited, before the shadows lengthened, there was only the sense of two immense forces approaching the same center. Not yet colliding, not yet speaking through conflict, simply moving closer. And in that narrowing space, history was already deciding that there would not be room for both to remain unchanged. Both figures emerged from environments where control preceded choice. Childhood was not a prelude. It was a crucible. Discipline arrived early and stayed late. Performance was not a pathway toward freedom, but the condition of belonging. In different cities, under different roofs, the same lesson was learned. Value was earned through execution. Love arrived through approval. Silence followed failure. One grew up inside an apparatus. Family, stage, audience, and authority collapsed into a single structure. Repetition became safety. Precision became protection. The body learned to obey before it learned to desire. Expression was filtered through expectation long before it reached language. Success came early, so early that identity fused with function. To stop performing would have meant disappearing. The self became inseparable from reception. The other grew up inside isolation. Not absence of pressure, but absence of shelter. Control was present, but not collective. It was singular, focused, sharp. Mastery of instruments became refuge. Sound became a private territory where agency could exist without negotiation, where one learned to survive by blending into a system, the other learned to survive by building one internally. Autonomy became obsession because it was once denied. Their formative years unfolded in the American Midwest, far from the glamour that would later define them. These were cities marked by industry, labor, restraint. Emotional expression was not encouraged. Toughness was currency. Sensitivity had to be hidden or converted into skill. Music became the acceptable channel through which intensity could move without being named. Rhythm replaced speech. Performance replaced confession. As adolescence arrived, divergence sharpened. One learned how to disappear into excellence. The other learned how to confront through excess. One refined every gesture until it dissolved into illusion. The other exaggerated gesture until it became confrontation. Both responses were adaptive. Both carried cost. One risked erasure behind perfection. The other risked isolation behind defiance. The industry did not create these differences. It recognized and amplified them. By the late 70s, popular music was reorganizing itself around scale. The album was no longer enough. Image had to travel with sound. Persona had to survive repetition. Television compressed distance. Radio standardized intimacy. To succeed meant not just being heard, but being seen everywhere without losing coherence. In that environment, one artist offered continuity. Familiarity elevated to art. He appeared to embody the promise that mass culture could remain elegant, that refinement could survive saturation, that the audience could be unified around a single emotional frequency. His persona absorbed contradictions rather than projecting them. Innocence and control coexisted without visible strain. The public learned to trust that balance. The other artist offered rupture. He refused to resolve contradictions. Sexuality collided with spirituality. Masculinity blurred into ambiguity. Control was asserted not through polish, but through refusal. He produced himself, played everything, changed names, withdrew when visibility threatened autonomy. He turned scarcity into leverage. The public learned to feel challenged, sometimes unsettled, but rarely indifferent. Psychologically, the contrast deepened. One identity was structured around being desired without provoking anxiety. The other was structured around provoking anxiety as a form of desire. One invited projection through openness. The other invited projection through opacity. One seemed to offer the ideal image the audience wanted to inhabit. The other reflected back impulses the audience preferred not to recognize. These dynamics aligned with broader cultural tensions. The late 70s and early 80s were negotiating shifts in race, gender, and power within mainstream media. Visibility was expanding, but conditions were rigid. To cross boundaries required either exceptional assimilation or deliberate disruption. One path promised access through reassurance. The other promised transformation through pressure. Both carried symbolic weight beyond individual careers. As success accelerated, desire entered the equation in a new form. Not simply the desire to create, but the desire to occupy the center. Recognition became spatial. Awards, charts, headlines, and airplay formed a visible hierarchy. To rise was to displace. To remain was to defend. Admiration no longer traveled innocently. It acquired direction. It became comparative. The industry encouraged this structure because it simplified narrative. Two figures, two styles, two answers to the same question. Media learned how to frame opposition as inevitability. Even similarities were presented as competition. Shared influences became points of rivalry. Shared achievements became measures of dominance. Silence was interpreted as strategy, absence as refusal. Psychologically, rivalry did not require hatred. It required mirroring. Each figure became a reference point the other could not ignore. Success in one camp registered as pressure in the other, regardless of intent. Desire learned how to imitate itself through the rival. Recognition of the other threatened to destabilize the self-image each had constructed to survive. For one, being compared risked undoing the carefully maintained illusion of uniqueness. His identity depended on singularity that appeared natural rather than asserted. To acknowledge competition openly would have meant admitting vulnerability. To deny it entirely required controlling narrative. Distance became defense. Politeness masked tension. Precision masked fear of displacement. For the other, comparison threatened autonomy. To be framed alongside another risked absorption into a hierarchy he did not design. His response was not withdrawal, but escalation. More control, more provocation, more refusal. If the system insisted on comparison, he would destabilize the terms. If there had to be a mirror, he would crack it. Their psychological architectures thus moved toward collision, not through direct confrontation, but through accumulation. Each success added weight, each omission added meaning, each story retold by others hardened into symbol. The rivalry was no longer private or accidental. It became structural, a feature of the cultural environment rather than a personal dispute. By the early 80s, the field was set. The stage had narrowed. The audience had learned how to watch. The media had learned how to frame. Two figures carried opposing solutions to the same cultural anxiety: how to hold power without being consumed by it, how to remain visible without dissolving into noise, how to survive desire once it becomes collective. The conditions did not demand conflict, but they guaranteed friction. Desire, once mediated, seeks a rival. Identity, once projected, invites reflection. The groundwork had been laid long before any specific incident ignited public narrative. What followed would not be an accident or misunderstanding. It would be the logical consequence of two symbolic forces occupying the same historical center. The rivalry was ready to unfold. The first rupture did not arrive as confrontation. It arrived as exposure, a stage shared briefly, a sequence of gestures interpreted afterward through retelling. What mattered was not intention but outcome. In an arena saturated with symbolism, one figure appeared in command of the moment, the other momentarily displaced. The event lasted minutes. Its echo lasted decades. The setting mattered. A concert anchored in legacy, hosted by a figure who embodied lineage and authority. The invitation itself carried weight. To be called forward was to be tested publicly. When one performer entered, the crowd responded as expected. Recognition flowed instantly. The body moved with calibrated confidence. The audience mirrored certainty back to the stage. Order was restored through mastery. Then the challenge extended. Another name was spoken. Another body stepped forward. The shift was immediate. The environment changed temperature. Expectation became uncertainty. The crowd did not know how to receive what followed. The instruments did not cooperate. The stage, once stable, became hostile. A misjudged gesture transformed spectacle into collapse. What should have been ascension became descent in full view of witnesses. The incident would later be described as humiliation, sabotage, accident, inevitability. Each interpretation revealed more about the interpreter than the event itself. In a culture trained to read performance as identity, failure became personal. The fall was not absorbed by context. It attached itself to narrative. It became proof, rumor, cautionary tale. The image circulated because it satisfied a deeper hunger for hierarchy. For the figure who had already mastered the center, the moment confirmed position. It demonstrated the difference between control and risk. His authority remained intact because it appeared effortless. He did not need to attack. The structure did the work for him. Applause aligned with gravity. The system reinforced itself. Silence afterward carried more power than commentary. For the figure who fell, the moment cut deeper. It crystallized the cost of exposure without control. The crowd was not hostile, but it was unprepared. The environment had not been shaped to his terms. Autonomy vanished under borrowed lighting. What lingered was not the attempt, but the collapse. The memory refused to soften with time. This was not merely an interpersonal wound. It was symbolic displacement. The arena revealed its rules. One could challenge the center only by first mastering it. Transgression without ownership invited punishment. The lesson was absorbed, not articulated. Future choices would carry its imprint. Control would tighten. Access would narrow. Visibility would be negotiated rather than assumed. Media coverage transformed the incident into myth. Details shifted. Motives were assigned retroactively. The moment became origin story. Rivalry needed a beginning, and this fit the structure perfectly. A hero affirmed. A challenger exposed. The simplicity was irresistible. Complexity dissolved in repetition. The audience learned how to remember it without ever having been there. What followed was not immediate retaliation, but recalibration. Releases became statements. Absence became signal. Each move was read as response, whether intended or not. The center of gravity had been identified, and both figures adjusted accordingly. One consolidated, the other rearmed. When dominance reached its apex, it did so with unprecedented force. Records shattered. Images saturated global screens. The body became iconographic. Movement became language. Music crossed borders without translation. The stage expanded until it resembled empire. Success no longer needed defense. It simply occupied space. For the rival watching from the perimeter, this expansion applied pressure. The center was no longer abstract. It was visible everywhere. To challenge it required not imitation, but escalation. Matching scale would be impossible. The alternative was intensity. If the arena could not be taken, it would be transformed. If the spotlight could not be owned, it would be bent. The response arrived as synthesis. Sound, image, and narrative fused into a single artifact. Music became cinematic. The album became world. Desire, rebellion, and discipline collided within a self-authored mythology. The work did not ask for permission. It announced arrival through force of coherence. The public responded because it felt different, not safer, sharper. This escalation shifted the rivalry's axis. It was no longer about charts alone. It was about authorship, about who controlled not just performance, but meaning. One figure represented perfection delivered at scale. The other represented creation wrested from constraint. The industry now had two poles powerful enough to organize identity around them. The tension intensified because it could not be resolved through comparison. Metrics failed to settle it. Sales answered one question. Influence answered another. Innovation answered a third. Each victory in one domain exposed vulnerability in another. The rivalry thickened. It became less about winning and more about surviving proximity. What began as a moment on a borrowed stage had matured into structural opposition. Each figure now carried the other as shadow. Presence implied resistance. Absence implied calculation. The system amplified every signal. The audience learned how to watch for signs of dominance and defiance. The conflict no longer required direct interaction. It was unfolding through parallel motion. The escalation was underway. As dominance consolidated on one side, strategy hardened on the other. The rivalry entered a phase where refusal carried as much meaning as participation. Invitations became tests. Collaborations became battlegrounds imagined rather than realized. What did not happen began to matter as much as what did. Absence itself acquired narrative weight. When a collective moment emerged, framed as unity, charity, and historical convergence, it exposed the fault lines beneath the surface. The gathering was designed to collapse difference into chorus. Many voices, one song, one cause. The structure required proximity. Bodies aligned shoulder to shoulder. ego subordinated to spectacle of togetherness. For most, participation promised inclusion within history. One figure stood at the center of that structure, not by assertion, but by gravitational pull. His presence stabilized the room. The environment bent around him. Authority expressed itself quietly. He did not need to negotiate space. It arrived pre-cleared. The project affirmed his role as symbolic anchor, the one through whom collective meaning could pass without fragmentation. The other declined, not loudly, not with explanation. The refusal was partial, conditional, precise. An offer to contribute without proximity. A gesture that preserved autonomy while appearing cooperative. It was rejected. The system required sameness to function. Separation threatened coherence. In that moment, refusal was interpreted as arrogance, insecurity, or defiance, depending on the observer's allegiance. Psychologically, the refusal was consistent. Crowds diluted control. Proximity dissolved authorship. Participation on those terms would have meant surrendering the very difference that sustained his identity. Better to stand outside than to be absorbed into a spectacle that erased friction. Yet culturally, the cost was significant. Absence hardened perception. It reinforced polarity. It turned choice into statement. Media amplified the divide. The narrative wrote itself. One figure as humanitarian center. The other a solitary figure refusing alignment. Complexity disappeared beneath symbolism. The audience learned how to moralize aesthetic difference. Collaboration was framed as virtue, distance as deficiency. The rivalry shifted from creative contrast into ethical shorthand. Attempts at direct convergence followed. Meetings arranged. Songs proposed. Each carried risk. To collaborate would have been to share authorship of meaning itself. Lyrics became contested territory. Language revealed hierarchy. A single phrase could invert power. What sounded like confidence from one mouth could sound like submission from another. Negotiation stalled because symbolism outweighed sound. The refusal to merge was not merely personal. It was structural. One figure's authority depended on occupying the universal. The others depended on resisting universality altogether. A duet would have required a shared center. None existed. The distance between them was not emotional. It was architectural. As the rivalry matured, gestures grew sharper. Humor edged toward mockery. Irony hardened into dismissal. Each comment was dissected for intent. Even ambiguity became weaponized. The public read every utterance as position. Silence was no longer neutral. It was strategic opacity. Meanwhile, the marketplace continued to reward both paths. Scale and saturation produced unprecedented reach. Independence and excess produced cultic intensity. Success arrived through different economies of desire, one through repetition and reassurance, the other through disruption and challenge. Each success threatened the other's legitimacy simply by existing. The tension expressed itself through substitution. Characters appeared in narratives. Archetypes stood in for rivals. Videos staged confrontations without naming them. Bodies performed dominance symbolically. These were not messages sent to audiences. They were signals exchanged across distance, mediated by industry and interpretation. At the psychological level, the rivalry deepened through mirroring. Each figure embodied what the other could not become without loss. Control without provocation. Provocation without surrender. To integrate the other would have required dismantling the self that had been constructed for survival. The rivalry persisted because it protected identity even as it intensified pressure. As time advanced, the cost of maintaining these positions increased. Fame amplified scrutiny. Control required constant vigilance. Autonomy demanded isolation. The very strategies that had enabled ascent began to constrain movement. The center became heavier. The perimeter became lonelier. Yet retreat was impossible. The audience had invested. The media had codified roles. History had framed the conflict as essential. To soften would have been read as concession. To escalate risked collapse. The rivalry entered a suspended state, maintained through ritual, rumor, and selective memory. By this phase, the conflict no longer required interaction. It existed as an organizing principle. Fans aligned identity through preference. Industry narratives recycled opposition. Each new release was positioned within an inherited frame. The artists moved forward, but the shadow moved with them. The rivalry had transcended events. It had become structure. As the rivalry settled into structure, its expression grew more oblique. Direct encounters became rare, but signals multiplied. Meaning traveled through gesture rather than statement, through staging rather than speech, through the careful management of visibility. What mattered was not confrontation, but position within the field. One figure continued to expand the center by refining it. Each release reinforced an architecture of control that had learned how to scale without fracture. Precision increased. The margin for error narrowed. Spectacle became seamless. The body moved as if insulated from gravity, as if the mechanics of effort had been erased. The audience was invited to believe not in struggle, but in transcendence. This promise carried enormous appeal, but it demanded constant maintenance. The other figure responded by intensifying authorship. Output accelerated. Control tightened. Sound mutated faster than the industry could absorb. Identities shifted. Names dissolved. Withdrawal alternated with excess. The message was clear without being stated. Access would be granted only on his terms. Visibility would be negotiated. If the center could not be claimed, it would be destabilized through unpredictability. This divergence revealed itself most clearly in how each approached power. One embodied it through accumulation. Records, awards, saturation, repetition. Authority expressed itself through ubiquity. The other embodied power through refusal. Ownership, isolation, scarcity. Authority expressed itself through distance. Both strategies worked. Both exacted cost. As the years progressed, strain became visible. For the one who had mastered the center, the pressure of remaining universal intensified. The persona that once absorbed projection now attracted suspicion. Control began to read as concealment. Innocence as performance. The spotlight, once obedient, became interrogative. Every gesture was scrutinized for fracture. The center, once expansive, began to feel claustrophobic. For the one who had defended autonomy through separation, isolation deepened. Control hardened into rigidity. Refusal risked becoming compulsion. The perimeter, once liberating, narrowed. The freedom to create without compromise came at the price of increasing solitude. The very distance that protected authorship also limited resonance. The rivalry, though dormant on the surface, intensified beneath it. Each figure now represented not just an aesthetic choice, but a philosophy of survival within mass culture. One path suggested that mastery of the system could grant safety. The other suggested that resistance was the only form of integrity. Audiences aligned accordingly, often without conscious awareness. Media narratives adjusted to reflect this shift. Early stories of competition gave way to stories of contrast. One framed as fragile despite power, the other framed as defiant despite marginalization. Sympathy redistributed, authority destabilized. The rivalry no longer depended on who sold more or who charted higher. It depended on who appeared to endure. Late period gestures carried accumulated meaning. A performance could be read as assertion or defense, a lyric as confession or provocation, a refusal as principle or fear. Interpretation overwhelmed intention. The system no longer needed new events. It fed on reinterpretation of the past, looping memory into reinforcement. What had once been a rivalry of ascent became a rivalry of survival. The question shifted from who would dominate to who could remain intact. The center and the perimeter both revealed their vulnerabilities. Control invited collapse under scrutiny. Autonomy invited disappearance through isolation. Neither position offered resolution. The rivalry persisted because it mirrored a deeper cultural anxiety. How to exist authentically within systems that demand legibility. How to retain authorship when visibility multiplies distortion. How to remain singular without becoming alien. Each figure offered an answer that was compelling precisely because it was incomplete. By the time overt conflict faded from headlines, the structure remained fully active. New artists inherited the divide without knowing its origin. Fans learned allegiance as identity. The industry learned how to monetize opposition without requiring antagonists. The rivalry had become self-sustaining. What remained was not bitterness or reconciliation, but residue. A tension embedded in how pop culture understands power. A memory that organizes expectation. A shadow that persists even when the figures themselves move beyond the stage. The rivalry had finished unfolding. Its consequences had not. By the time the rivalry had fully detached from events, it had already migrated into culture as grammar. It no longer needed incidents to sustain itself. It functioned as an organizing opposition through which audiences learned how to read pop itself. Preference became identity. Alignment became interpretation. To choose one figure was not merely to select music, but to affirm a position within a larger symbolic order. The opposition mapped cleanly onto cultural anxieties that extended far beyond entertainment. One pole represented coherence, the promise that mass visibility could still feel unified, safe, and emotionally legible. The other represented rupture, the insistence that truth required friction, risk, and discomfort. These were not abstract values. They played out in how bodies were allowed to move, how desire was coded, how vulnerability could be displayed without punishment. Media ecosystems accelerated this polarization. Television, radio, print, and later digital circulation did not merely report difference. They engineered contrast. Images were cropped, quotes isolated, narratives simplified. The rivalry became a shorthand through which complexity could be consumed quickly. Audiences did not need to understand context. They needed symbols that could be recognized instantly and defended emotionally. This produced tribalism without explicit hostility. Fans organized themselves through admiration that quietly excluded the other. Praise became comparative even when unspoken. Influence was framed as zero-sum. To elevate one legacy was perceived as diminishing the other. Cultural conversation adopted the logic of scarcity, even when abundance was evident. At the level of genre, the impact was profound. Pop no longer described a sound. It described a battleground between assimilation and autonomy. Artists entering the field were measured against this inherited polarity. They were asked implicitly which lineage they belonged to. Were they builders of universal spectacle or architects of controlled transgression? Were they seeking the center or redefining the perimeter? Race and visibility were central to this symbolic function. One figure appeared to neutralize racial tension by rendering it invisible, offering a form of universality that seemed to transcend specificity. The other foreground race, gender, and sexuality as sites of deliberate tension. Neither approach resolved the underlying contradictions of representation. Instead, they offered competing strategies for survival within systems that demanded legibility while punishing deviation. Gender expression became another axis of projection. One body was disciplined into smoothness, ambiguity managed through elegance. The other weaponized ambiguity, refusing reassurance. These contrasting embodiments gave audiences permission to desire differently. They also revealed the limits of tolerance. What was celebrated in one context became threatening in another. Acceptance proved conditional. The rivalry reshaped how power was imagined in performance. Authority could be expressed through command of scale or through command of space, through saturation or through scarcity, through being everywhere or by choosing when to appear. This dual model remains active. Contemporary artists continue to negotiate these inherited options, often without realizing their origin. Media theory helps explain why the rivalry endured. The environment did not simply transmit content. It reshaped perception. The more the figures circulated, the more they became environments themselves. Their images conditioned expectation. Their differences structured attention. The rivalry functioned less like a debate and more like an atmosphere. Mythology emerged naturally from this repetition. Each figure occupied a role larger than biography. One became the eternal center, suspended above time, frozen in peak form. The other became the eternal challenger, restless, shape-shifting, refusing closure. These myths resisted revision because they served collective needs. They organized longing and anxiety in ways that felt coherent. The symbolic conflict also provided a safe container for more unsettling questions. How much control is too much? When does refinement become erasure? When does autonomy become isolation? These questions could be explored through allegiance rather than introspection. The rivalry allowed audiences to externalize tension rather than resolve it internally. Importantly, the conflict did not produce synthesis. It produced a field, a space in which multiple interpretations could coexist without reconciliation. This lack of closure is why the rivalry retained power. It did not tell culture what to think. It gave culture a structure within which to argue endlessly. Even as new genres emerged and new technologies transformed distribution, the underlying symbolic pattern persisted. Algorithms now perform the work once done by editors. Polarization is automated. Preference is tracked, reinforced, and fed back. The rivalry anticipated this logic. It taught culture how to divide attention efficiently. What endures is not hostility, but architecture. A way of organizing meaning around opposition. A template for how greatness is framed through contrast. A reminder that cultural power rarely exists without a mirror, and that mirrors, once installed, are difficult to remove. The rivalry had fully exceeded its origin. It had become a cultural instrument. When the rivalry reached its final phase, it did not conclude. It dispersed. What remained was not resolution, but sediment. Layers of meaning compacted by repetition, reinterpretation, and loss. The figures themselves began to recede from the immediate present, yet the structure they had generated showed no sign of erosion. Absence intensified symbol rather than dissolving it. Time altered perception unevenly. One legacy crystallized around an image of suspended perfection. The body frozen at its peak, endlessly replayed, endlessly restored. Movement detached from aging. Voice detached from fragility. History compressed into a loop where decline had no visual language. This preservation reinforced centrality. The figure remained the axis around which popular memory continued to turn. The other legacy resisted fixation. It scattered across archives, aliases, unreleased material, and sudden reinventions. No single image could hold it. To engage with it required effort. Curiosity replaced nostalgia. The figure persisted less as icon and more as system, a methodology of control, refusal, and reinvention that could be re-entered but never fully possessed. Death did not equalize these positions. It clarified them. One absence intensified collective mourning, reinforcing myth through grief. The other absence produced reevaluation, as distance allowed complexity to surface where provocation once dominated. In both cases, loss completed the symbolic roles they had inhabited while alive. The center became eternal. The perimeter became infinite. Public narrative softened in tone, but not in structure. Retrospective admiration replaced overt rivalry, yet comparison remained implicit. Tributes revealed allegiance through emphasis. Histories were written through selective framing. Even reconciliation was narrated as asymmetry, one remembered as universal loss, the other as singular force. The architecture of opposition endured beneath the language of respect. Culturally, the rivalry's aftermath reshaped how legacy itself is understood. Greatness became inseparable from contrast. Influence required an opposing figure to define its contours. The idea of a lone genius felt insufficient. The public had learned to expect mirroring, to understand significance through relational tension rather than isolated achievement. The industry absorbed this lesson fully. Marketing strategies adopted rivalry as default narrative. New artists were positioned against predecessors. Genres were framed as reactions rather than evolutions. Conflict became a tool for attention management. The template refined by this rivalry proved endlessly reusable. Psychologically, the figures came to represent divergent responses to visibility that remain unresolved. One path suggested survival through mastery of perception, even at the cost of personal opacity. The other suggested survival through authorship and control, even at the cost of connection. Neither path resolved the underlying contradiction of being seen without being consumed. This unresolved tension is the rivalry's true legacy. It does not instruct. It persists. It reminds culture that power demands shape, and shape demands opposition. That visibility is never neutral. That the center and the edge define each other through pressure rather than dialogue. There is no final verdict because none is required. The rivalry functions as a permanent lens, not a closed chapter. It continues to organize memory, taste, and aspiration. It remains relevant because it mirrors conditions that have only intensified. Saturation, polarization, the struggle for authorship within systems that reward legibility over truth. What endures is not who won. It is the clarity the rivalry provides about how culture operates when scale collides with individuality. When perfection confronts excess, when universality meets refusal. The figures no longer move across the stage, but the stage they shaped remains active.